The refugee camp had no name on any official map, and that was the point. Joel Mercer had learned that fact on his third day at Outpost Bithara when he'd asked the logistics coordinator, a sharp-eyed woman named Dana, why the settlement didn't appear in any of the coalition's humanitarian databases. She'd looked at him the way people look at someone who has just asked why the sky is blue, as though the answer were so obvious it barely deserved language. Because if it has a name, she'd said, someone can file a petition to have it decommissioned. He'd understood then. Names gave things permanence. Permanence invited bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, in this particular corner of the Sullivan corridor, was a death sentence dressed in administrative language. What the camp did have was 1,400 Osavari refugees, 3 failing water reclamators, 1 medical bay staffed entirely by a field AI with a bedside manner like a tax audit, and Joel. Just Joel. He'd been here 11 months, which made him the longest-serving volunteer in the program's short and largely abandoned history. The coalition's official position on Osavari resettlement was ongoing review. The unofficial position, which everyone in the camp understood fluently, was that the Osavari had backed the wrong faction in the Thyranus conflict and were now paying the particular price reserved for people who had been right about things too early and too loudly. Joel had read the reports. He believed the reports. He'd come anyway, because believing in something and doing something about it were 2 separate skills, and most people only develop the first. He told himself he was here because of the reports. That was mostly true. But there was something else. Something he hadn't told Dana. Something he hadn't told anyone at Outpost Vithara, and it sat in his chest some mornings like a stone that had learned to breathe. He was carrying a question he needed answered, and he suspected, irrationally, stubbornly, that the answer lived somewhere among these people. The morning he found her, it was raining in the way that only happened on Sullivan's equatorial plateau, a warm, sideways rain that smelled of copper and something faintly floral, that soaked through clothing without any sense of urgency, as if it had all the time in the world and understood you didn't. Joel had walked the camp's eastern perimeter before dawn, checking on a section of shelter panels that had started buckling under the previous night's wind. He'd rounded the last support strut and nearly stepped on her. She was tucked into the narrow gap between the strut's base and the embankment wall, a space so small that a human adult could not have occupied it without breaking something. But Osavari were built for compression. Their skeletal structure was partially articulated in ways that still made human physicians uncomfortable, and she had folded herself into that space with the precise economy of someone who had been hiding for a very long time. What stopped Joel from retreating immediately wasn't her size or her stillness or even the sound she wasn't making. It was her eyes. Osavari eyes had no whites. They were a continuous field of iridescent color, layered like oil on water, and they shifted with the creature's emotional state in ways that Osavari linguists insisted was not technically communication, but which felt, unmistakably, like reading. Hers were deep amber shading toward a fractured violet at the edges, a color combination he'd never seen cataloged in any of the cultural briefings, and the briefings had been extensive. He didn't know what that color meant. He would spend the next 72 hours learning that it meant she had already decided she was going to die. He crouched down slowly, the rain pattering against the back of his neck, and said the only Osavari greeting he knew with any confidence. Varethi. It meant something close to, I see you, and something close to, I mean no claim. The distinction between the two was apparently a matter of tonal register, and Joel had never been entirely sure which one he was producing, but he said it and held very still. Her eyes shifted. The amber didn't leave, but the violet deepened, and then something new moved through them. A quick, green-silver flash that the briefings associated with involuntary threat assessment. She was deciding whether he was worth the energy of running. She decided he wasn't. Or maybe she decided he wasn't a threat. Joel chose to interpret it as the latter, because it was the kind of morning where optimism felt like a survival strategy. I'm not going to touch you, he said in Standard, because his Osavari only extended so far. I'm just going to sit here for a minute. Is that okay? She made no sound. He sat. The rain continued its unhurried assault. Somewhere in the middle distance, a child called out something in Osavari, one of the camp's younger residents, chasing another through the shelter row, conducting the kind of ordinary chaos that existed even at the end of the world. The sound reached her, and Joel watched something happen in her expression that he couldn't name but recognized, the involuntary softening of a creature who has been separated from something they love. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a ration bar. It was a terrible ration bar. The coalition contracted with whatever supplier offered the lowest bid, which meant the current batch tasted vaguely of cardboard that had briefly met a strawberry. But it was food, and it was warm from being against his body. He set it on the ground between them and moved his hand back to his knee. He did not offer it. He did not push it toward her. He simply put it there. It was the kind of gesture that meant almost nothing in human terms. You gave someone hungry a thing to eat, basic mechanics. He would later learn that among the Osavari, placing food between yourself and another without expecting it to be received was a ceremonial act reserved for mourning rites, specifically for offerings made to someone who had already passed beyond reach. He'd accidentally told her he was saying goodbye to someone he'd lost. He hadn't been wrong. She stared at the ration bar for a long moment. Then she reached out and took it, and the amber in her eyes cracked open into something gold. Her name, she eventually communicated through a camp translator, a stooped elder named Veyrath, who seemed exhausted by the existence of all things, but performed the service with scrupulous care, was Ilive. She was 31 years old in Osavari reckoning, which the briefing suggested translated to something between 40 and 50 in human developmental terms. She had been a keeper of signal on Thyranus, which was roughly analogous to an archivist but carried spiritual weight the way a bridge carries traffic. Structurally, essentially, invisibly. She had no family left in the camp. She had, Veyrath conveyed with the flatness of someone summarizing a weather report, no family anywhere. What she had lost was what the Osavari called a Velthari, a binding partner, not a spouse in the human sense, but something adjacent and something more. A companion chosen through a years-long process of mutual observation and psychological integration. A connection so woven into the fabric of daily cognition that its loss did not feel like grief so much as it felt like the removal of a sense. She had watched her Velthari die on a transit ship that the Coalition had promised was safe, and which had not been. Joel listened to all of this through Veyrath's flat translations and did not say he was sorry, because he'd learned early that the phrase meant nothing to Osavari. Their language had no equivalent, because their philosophy held that sorrow shared without capacity to repair was a form of noise. Instead, he said in careful Osavari, Varethi Vorin, I see you. I see what you carry. Veyrath looked at him with something approaching surprise. Ilive's eyes went entirely gold. The days that followed had a texture Joel hadn't expected. Porous, layered, full of small misunderstandings that accumulated into something that was either communication or its more complex sibling. He brought her the morning water allocation himself, because her shelter was at the far end of the distribution row, and she was not the kind of person who pushed through crowds. The first time he handed her the container, she held it in both hands and dipped her head forward, a gesture he returned instinctively, a sort of nod, which he later discovered was the Osavari equivalent of formally accepting a debt. He had apparently agreed to owe her something. He was never entirely sure what. She misread him constantly and gracefully. When he laughed at something Veyrath said, a dry observation about the field AI's attempts at compassionate language, she went very still and then retreated 2 paces, because in her cultural framework, laughter in a social context was an assertion of dominance, and she was unsure whether she'd been included or catalogued. He had to learn to explain his own face to her, which turned out to be the most honest conversation he'd had in years. When I smile, he said, through Veyrath's translation, it means I'm relaxed. It means I feel safe. When I laugh, it means I found something surprising and good. She considered this. Then she said something Veyrath translated as, your face lies frequently in order to tell the truth. He thought about that for 3 days. She watched him work. He was the camp's only logistics volunteer, which meant he handled everything from shelter maintenance to supply disputes to the particular nightmare of coalition paperwork. Forms that required signatures from entities who had been dissolved, approvals from departments that no longer existed, requests submitted in quadruplicate to systems that returned automated rejections with the cheerfulness of something that had never been alive. He worked on this while sitting at a folding table outside the main shelter row, and she began to sit nearby, not with him, not facing him, but at an angle that in Osavari social geometry apparently meant, I choose to be in proximity to this occurrence. Dana found this hilarious. You've got a shadow, she said one afternoon, dropping off a supply manifest. I've got a neighbor, Joel said. There's a difference. Is there? He didn't answer. The truth was that he wasn't sure. The truth was that her presence near him had started to feel like a kind of calibration, that he noticed things more precisely when she was watching, worked more carefully, thought more clearly. He told himself this was the effect of being observed. He suspected it was something else. Now, if you're enjoying this story so far, consider subscribing. There are many more like this one waiting for you. She asked him about the stone. He'd had it in his jacket pocket every day for 11 months, a piece of matte gray mineral from a planet called Draveris that he'd never visited. It had belonged to his brother Marcus, who had visited Draveris on a survey mission 4 years ago and mailed it home before dying in a pressurization accident 6 weeks later. The accident had been ruled equipment failure. The investigation had been a masterpiece of institutional incuriosity. Joel had filed every appeal available to him, had pushed until the coalition's legal apparatus had pushed back with the full weight of its disinterest, and had eventually understood that some answers are not given so much as they are surrendered to. He'd come to the camp because Marcus had believed in this work. Because if Joel kept moving in the direction his brother had pointed, it was one way of not standing still in the grief. The stone was the question he still couldn't answer. Why? Not why the accident. Why Draveris? Why Marcus had gone so far out of his way to send this particular unremarkable rock home with a note that said simply, "This place is something else. You'd understand it better than I do." He'd never understood it. He'd carried it anyway. When Ilive asked about it, when she reached out one morning and touched the air near his jacket pocket with two fingers, which was the Osavari gesture for, "What is that thing that belongs to you?" he took it out and showed it to her. She held it, and something extraordinary happened to her eyes. The gold went deep and still. Then she made a sound he'd never heard her make, a low, resonant hum, not quite speech, that Veyrath, passing by, translated without being asked. She says, "This is a keeper's stone, from the Dravaris formation. They were used by Osavari signal keepers in the old diaspora period to anchor communication across distance. She says she has not seen one in 20 years. She says, 'Where did you get this?' Joel told her, all of it. Through Veyrath's translation, in pieces and reversals and corrections, while the equatorial sun moved across the sky and the camp settled into its afternoon rhythms, he told her about Marcus, about the accident, about the appeals, about the note, about the question he'd been carrying. She listened with the complete stillness of her people, which he'd learned was not absence but the opposite, a quality of attention so total it had a physical weight. When he finished, she held the stone out to him and said something. Veyrath was quiet for a moment after translating. Then he said, "She says, your brother knew what he was doing. The Draveris stones are used by keepers to send something across a distance that words cannot cross. She says your brother sent you the stone because the stone itself is the message. She says, you already understood. You came here." Joel sat with that for a long time. The stone was warm from her hands. The crisis came on the 43rd day of knowing her, which was the day the coalition sent an administrative notice that Outpost Vithara would be reclassified as a temporary holding zone, a designation that under coalition law triggered a 30-day resettlement review, during which all camp residents would be reevaluated for refugee status. The practical consequence of this, which Dana explained to him at 6 in the morning with the controlled fury of someone who had been awake all night, was that approximately 300 residents, including many of the oldest and most vulnerable, were likely to have their status revoked on procedural grounds, including Ilive, whose documentation had been lost in the same transit disaster that had taken her Velthari. Joel spent 12 hours on the comm, calling every contact he had in the coalition's humanitarian division, which turned out to number fewer useful allies than he'd believed, and more voicemail systems than any civilization should have produced. He filed emergency injunctions. He submitted documentation requests. He called Dana's commanding officer, a woman named Diana, who was sympathetic in the way that people are sympathetic when they want you to understand that sympathy is all they have left to offer. At hour 13, Ilive found him at his folding table, the surface buried in screens and printed forms, and 3 empty cups of whatever the camp's nutrition dispenser was calling coffee that week. She sat across from him, not beside him, not at an angle, across, facing, the most direct positional statement in her cultural vocabulary. She looked at his face. She had learned to read it. She said something without the translator present, and he didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone completely. It was the tone of someone who has spent a long time being fought for by no one, and who has not yet learned how to accept it without terror. He put both his palms flat on the table between them. She looked at his hands. He watched her remember. He could see it move through her eyes, the gold shifting, recognizing, the ration bar, the first morning, the object placed between two people as an offering. He had not known then what it meant. He knew now. He did it now on purpose. "I am not saying goodbye. I am staying in this." The green-silver flash, the threat assessment, then it faded. Then she placed both her hands over his, and the gold in her eyes went so deep it was almost amber, almost the color she'd been when he'd found her in the gap beneath the shelter strut, but not quite. Something had moved in it. Some quality of the light had changed. And Veyrath, who had appeared soundlessly behind her in the way that translators in small camps learn to do, said quietly, "She says, I have not let anyone see me in 2 years. She says, you kept looking anyway." He filed the appeal that night. He worked until 4 in the morning, when Dana came in and sat beside him without a word and took half the paperwork. They worked until dawn. They submitted the package to 11 separate coalition departments simultaneously, which was either inspired bureaucratic judo or the most exhausting, futile gesture Joel had ever performed. And then they waited. The answer came in 9 days. Provisional status extended. Review suspended pending investigation of original documentation loss. An investigation that someone, somewhere in the system, had apparently decided was worth conducting. Joel never found out who. Some good things in bureaucracies are as faceless as the bad ones, and he decided that was okay. When he told Ilive, she was silent for a long time. Then she asked, through Veyrath, a question that surprised him. What will you do when this place has a name? He thought about it. Stay, he said. I think that's what my brother meant. She reached into the small pouch she carried at her side, a woven thing he'd never seen her open, and removed an object. It was a piece of gray matte mineral, slightly smaller than Marcus's stone, the same formation, the same dull surface hiding the way it caught light at certain angles. She set it on the table between them, not offering it, not pushing it toward him, simply placing it there. His throat closed. She says, Veyrath translated, his voice carrying something Joel had not heard from him before, a quiet that was also a kind of awe. She says, my Veltari gave me this. She says she carried it to carry him. She says, now you should carry both. She says a keeper's stone does not answer the question. It only shows you that someone else was asking it too. Joel looked at the two stones side by side on the folding table, Marcus's and hers, two pieces of the same ancient formation, two signals sent across impossible distances to find the people they were meant to reach, and understood that some questions are not solved but joined, not answered but inhabited, lived inside until they become something less like loss and more like direction. He picked up her stone. He placed it in his pocket beside his brother's. Outside, the equatorial rain had started again, unhurried, warm, carrying its faint scent of copper and something almost like flowers, pattering against the shelter panels with the sound of a world continuing. Ilive's eyes were gold all the way through. The camp still had no name on any official map, but for the first time in 11 months, Joel Mercer felt like he did. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. It means more than you know. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss a new one. Leave a like if you felt something, and turn on notifications so the next story finds you when you need it most. There are many more of these waiting for you, and every single one is made with the same care as this one.